The blizzard did not care about promises, or letters, or the fragile hope that carried a woman across half a continent. It only cared about the cold, and what it could take before morning. What Daniel Carrion found in the snow that night would change 2 lives forever. Wyoming Territory, winter of 1889, and the storm was already claiming its due. The wind came howling across the open plain, a sound sharp and feral enough to cut through the thick log walls of Daniel Carrion's barn. Snow slammed against the small windows in frantic bursts, smearing the world into a blur of white and shadow, erasing fence lines and swallowing the horizon whole. It was the kind of storm that made even seasoned ranchers pause their work and whisper a prayer they'd see the dawn. Daniel moved quickly, hands stiff with cold as he secured the last shutter, driving the iron latch home before the wind could wrench it loose. His breath steamed in the air, each exhale burning his lungs, when a sound rose above the storm. A horse screamed. Not a whinny, not a call, but a wild, panicked cry, torn straight from terror, coming from somewhere near the tree line at the far edge of his land. Daniel froze. The hammer slipped from his fingers and thudded softly into the snow. No animal made a sound like that unless something was terribly wrong. He grabbed his coat from the peg, dragged it on, and strode toward the corral, boots crunching through drifts already piling high. Flint, his gelding, paced restlessly, ears pinned forward, nostrils flaring as if he could sense the trouble too. "Easy, boy," Daniel muttered as he swung the saddle onto Flint's back, hands moving from long habit. "Let's see what fools out in this weather." The words came rough, but tension sat hard in his jaw. Nobody traveled in a blizzard unless desperation or death was driving them. Snow blinded him as soon as he rode out, the wind striking so hard it rattled his bones and cut through wool and leather like a knife. The scream came again, closer now, carried on the gale. Flint slowed near a bend in the trail, hooves sinking deep into fresh drifts, then stopped short. Daniel leaned forward, squinting through the white. And there, half buried beneath the snow, lay a body. A woman's body. She was face down, arms curled protectively around a small leather satchel as if even now she was afraid of losing it. Her dark hair was crusted with ice, strands frozen to her cheeks. Her dress was torn, soaked through, stiff as a frozen tarp. For one terrible heartbeat, Daniel thought he was already too late. He leaped from the saddle, stumbling through knee-deep snow, dropping beside her. His gloved hand brushed her shoulder. Cold. Too cold. "Ma'am," he called, voice cracking through the storm. "Can you hear me?" The wind nearly swallowed the faint sound that answered him, a thin, fragile breath, barely there. Relief hit him so hard his knees went weak. He carefully turned her face upward, brushing snow from her lips with shaking fingers. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused, lashes rimed with frost. "Please," she whispered, the word tearing out of her like it cost her something. Is this the Parker Ranch?" Daniel stiffened. The Parker Ranch. His closest neighbor. A man who had died 2 weeks earlier after months of failing health, buried now on a low hill blanketed in snow. "There's no one at the Parker place," Daniel said gently, leaning close so she could hear him over the wind. "Why were you trying to reach it?" Her lips trembled. He sent for me. A letter. I came all the way from Missouri." Her breath hitched, pain and cold tangled together. "Mail order bride." The word struck Daniel like a blow. Old Parker had never mentioned a wife, not once. No one in town had heard a thing. Had she crossed the country to marry a man already in the ground? "He wrote that he'd meet me," she went on weakly. I thought I saw a lantern." Her strength gave out. She sagged against him, consciousness slipping away. "Stay with me," Daniel said urgently, gathering her closer. "What's your name?" She struggled for air, each breath shallower than the last. "Brenda." Then her head fell forward, limp against his shoulder. Panic surged hot in Daniel's chest. The cold had gone too deep. She was minutes from freezing to death. No, he muttered fiercely, lifting her in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, just bones and snow-soaked cloth. Not tonight. You didn't come all this way to die in a ditch. He managed to get her onto Flint's back and climbed up behind her. The moment he pulled her close, he felt it. Her breathing was shallow, fading, her body rigid with cold. Without hesitation, he dragged off his own coat, wrapped it around her shoulders, then pressed her tight against his chest, giving her the only warmth he had left. The wind cut through his shirt instantly, stealing his breath, but he tightened his hold. "Come on, Brenda," he murmured into her frozen hair, voice raw with urgency. "Don't quit on me now." Her head lolled against him. He spurred Flint forward, heart pounding, snow slicing into his face like shards of glass. Her breath fluttered weakly against his ribs, slower, softer, too soft. Fear sharpened into something primal. "You don't get to die here," he growled near her ear, as if his words could anchor her to life. "Not when you've come this far. Not when someone was supposed to be waiting for you." He shielded her with his body as the storm screamed around them. At last, through the blinding white, the faint glow of his cabin lights appeared. Daniel kicked Flint into a desperate sprint. Tonight, life and death rode on minutes, and he refused to lose her. Warmth was the first thing Brenda noticed. Not heat exactly, but a gentle easing that crept beneath her skin, chasing away the ache in her bones. The second thing was the smell, rich and comforting, broth simmering with herbs somewhere close by. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw, but the scent made her stomach twist with need. She opened her eyes slowly. She lay on a narrow cot wrapped in heavy quilts. The room was dim, lit by a single oil lamp. Thick log walls rose around her, rough but solid. A cabin, modest and clean. She blinked and tried to sit up. Every muscle protested. Her head swam. She noticed a small tray on a stool beside her, metal bowls steaming with soup, a tin spoon, and a folded scrap of paper. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. "Eat first. Questions later." The handwriting was plain and steady. Brenda looked around. The cot was tucked behind a canvas curtain strung from nails for privacy. Her satchel rested neatly beside her, damp but intact. Her dress had been dried and folded, a thick flannel shirt laid on top. She recognized it from the night before. His shirt. Everything was arranged with care. No sign of rummaging. No sign of danger. Still, her chest tightened. She was alone in a stranger's home, yet she was alive. Slowly, she lifted the bowl and sipped the broth. It was simple, but warmth spread through her with each swallow. She ate carefully, tears pricking her eyes. The last thing she remembered was the storm, the man's voice cutting through it. "You don't get to die." The door creaked. She froze. Daniel stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat, and paused when he saw her awake. His eyes, a soft gray, met hers briefly. "You're awake," he said simply. "That's good." Brenda clutched the blanket. "Where am I?" "My cabin, near the ridgeline. I found you yesterday." She hesitated. "I don't remember much." "You were asking for the Parker Ranch," Daniel said. "He died 2 weeks ago." Her face crumpled. He sent for me." Daniel lifted a hand gently. "You can tell me when you're ready." She studied him. Tall, broad-shouldered, mid-30s perhaps, quiet in a way that spoke of long days alone. His face was lined by sun and wind. His hands, rough and calloused, rested loosely at his sides. Strong, but not threatening. "I should leave," she said softly, trying to rise. "I should go to town." "Can't," Daniel said calmly. He opened the door a crack, showing endless white, drifts waist deep. "You'd last an hour." Brenda sank back. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he replied. "Rest." I'll be outside. Night came. The wind howled, the fire crackled. After midnight, Brenda woke and pushed the curtain aside. Daniel sat by the door, still in his boots, watching the rafters, listening to the storm, guarding her. He hadn't left her alone once. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she lay back. Silence spoke louder than promises. The morning broke gray and still. Snow clung to the windows. Brenda sat at the small table wrapped in Daniel's flannel shirt, her own dress drying by the hearth. She told him about the letters, the promises, the future she believed in. He listened. He told her the truth about George Parker, about Silas Boone, about land tied to marriage. The dream shattered slowly. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she whispered. Daniel brought her hot cocoa and sat beside her, saying nothing, staying. The storm lingered. Days passed. They grew less like strangers. She helped. He let her. She cooked, mended, knitted. He watched quietly. Evenings were spent with her reading aloud while he worked. Laughter crept into the cabin. One morning he taught her to ride. She slipped. He caught her. They didn't let go right away. He carved her a spoon. She laughed, surprised and real. Gossip came. Jeb Carter warned him. Brenda packed that night, believing she had to leave to protect him. Daniel gave her a map and gold. "You're not a burden," he told her. "You're a person." The truth settled heavy between them as winter began to loosen its grip. He stood on the porch days later when Silas Boone rode up, arrogance on horseback, claiming land and bride as property. Brenda stood her ground. Daniel raised his rifle. The threat ended in the snow. When Silas rode away, spring crept closer. Brenda folded her shawl and asked Daniel if he meant to live alone forever. He told her about loss, about silence. She told him he'd already saved her. He offered her a choice. She chose to stay. Spring came quietly, not with a grand announcement, but with small mercies that only those who had survived the winter truly noticed. The snow softened first, losing its sharp edges, sinking back into the earth in slow, reluctant sighs. Water began to run in thin, wandering lines along the yard, cutting paths where none had existed before. The sky stayed gray, but it was a gentler gray now, a color that hinted at possibility instead of punishment. Inside the cabin, life shifted in subtle ways. Brenda no longer startled at every creak of the logs or rush of wind against the eaves. She moved through the space as though it belonged to her, not boldly, but naturally, as if the cabin itself had made room. She rose early, often before Daniel, and stoked the fire with practiced hands. The first morning he woke to the smell of fresh bread instead of coffee. He lay still for a moment, staring up at the ceiling beams, unsure how something so simple could unsettle him so deeply. He found her at the table, sleeves rolled, flour dusting her cheek. "You didn't have to," he said. She glanced up, a small smile touching her mouth. "I wanted to." That was becoming a pattern. Wanting. They spoke little about the future. There were no declarations, no grand plans laid out like survey lines. Instead, there were shared glances over steaming mugs, quiet understanding when one of them fell silent, an unspoken agreement that whatever came next would be met together, one day at a time. Brenda began to explore beyond the immediate yard as the snow receded. She walked the perimeter fence with Daniel, learning the lay of the land, asking careful questions. He showed her where the soil was richest, where water collected in the spring, where the wind cut hardest in winter. She listened intently, committing it all to memory as if she planned to belong to this place fully, not just pass through it. One afternoon, she found the small patch behind the cabin where the earth thawed first. She knelt there, fingers pressing into the damp soil, eyes thoughtful. "This would be good for herbs," she said. "And maybe flowers. Something that comes back every year." Daniel nodded. "Plant what you like. It struck him later that he hadn't said if you like, but what? As if the decision was already hers. The first real test of that quiet bond came when the road to town finally cleared enough for travel. Daniel mentioned it over supper, not casually, but not heavily either. If you want to go in, he said, eyes on his plate, now'd be the time. Brenda paused, spoon hovering. For a moment, he wondered if she would take the opening and leave without looking back. Instead, she set the spoon down carefully. I'll go, she said. But I'm coming back. He looked up then, surprised by the certainty in her voice. You don't owe me that, he said. She met his gaze, steady and calm. I know. Town was different than she remembered. Stone Hollow sat half buried in slush, wagons creaking through mud, men shouting over the scrape of shovels and the ring of hammers as repairs began. Heads turned when Brenda walked down the main street beside Daniel. Whispers followed, some curious, some sharp. She felt them like pinpricks along her spine but kept her chin high. Daniel stayed close, not touching, but present. They went first to the general store. Mrs. Halvorson, the owner's wife, paused mid-count when she saw Brenda. Her expression flickered through surprise, uncertainty, then something softer. You're the girl from the storm, she said. Brenda nodded. Yes, ma'am. There was a moment where the past could have hardened into something cruel, but instead Mrs. Halvorson sighed. Well, you look alive enough now. That's something. She rang up their supplies with brisk efficiency, slipping an extra sack of sugar into the bundle when she thought Daniel wasn't looking. At the post office, old Mr. Garvey peered over his spectacles. Didn't expect to see you again, he said bluntly. Brenda swallowed. Neither did I, she replied honestly. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Mail comes whether you're ready or not, he said. You'll find that out living out here. Outside, Daniel exhaled slowly. You all right? I am, she said, surprised to find it was true. Not everyone was kind. A man outside the saloon muttered something about stolen brides. Brenda stiffened, but before Daniel could speak, she turned and faced the man herself. I was nearly dead in a snowbank, she said clearly. If that offends you, you're welcome to try it yourself next winter. Laughter rippled from a nearby porch. The man flushed and looked away. Daniel watched her with something like awe. On the ride home, the wind was light, the sky opening in pale patches of blue. Brenda breathed deeply, the scent of thawing earth filling her lungs. I thought it would hurt more, she admitted. Being seen. Daniel nodded. It usually does. Maybe, she said. But it didn't break me. When they returned to the cabin, she unpacked the supplies with deliberate care, placing each item where it made sense. That night, as they ate by firelight, she reached across the table and rested her hand over his. The gesture was simple, unassuming, but it rooted him to the spot. He covered her fingers with his own, rough skin against hers, and neither of them spoke. Over the following weeks, the land woke fully. Daniel put Brenda to work beside him, not as a guest, but as a partner. He showed her how to check fence lines, how to spot a sick calf, how to read the sky for weather that hadn't yet announced itself. She showed him how to stretch supplies, how to plan meals weeks ahead, how to make a small space feel generous. They learned each other's silences. Daniel's came heavy in the evenings, when memories pressed in uninvited. Brenda's came when she thought about the life she'd left behind, the woman she had been before the snow. They didn't rush those moments. They let them pass, like clouds. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the plains in gold, Brenda asked quietly, "Do you ever regret staying?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he said at last. "But not in the way people think. I regret the years I spent thinking I deserved to be alone." She nodded, understanding more than she could explain. The first argument they had was over something small. Brenda wanted to move the table closer to the window. Daniel said it had always been where it was. The tension surprised them both. Silence stretched, brittle and unfamiliar. Finally, Brenda laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "We're arguing over furniture," she said. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Guess that means we're settled enough to argue." They moved the table. It stayed by the window. As spring turned to early summer, word spread that Brenda could read and write better than most folks in the valley. It started with one neighbor asking if she might help draft a letter. Then another asked if she could read a legal notice. Soon, children began to trail after her when she went into town, curious and eager. She mentioned it to Daniel one night, uncertain. "Would you mind," she asked, "if I taught them? Just the basics." He smiled. "Cabins big enough for voices." She set up a small corner with a chalkboard Daniel fashioned from scrap wood and soot. Lessons were informal at first, held when weather allowed. She taught letters, numbers, and how to sound out words. The children listened with rapt attention. Their parents lingered outside at first, skeptical, then quietly hopeful. Daniel watched from the doorway more than once, pride blooming unexpectedly in his chest. He had built this place with the idea that it would keep the world out. Brenda was turning it into something that welcomed people in. Not everyone approved. A few muttered that she was getting above herself, that a woman who arrived without a husband had no place teaching children. Daniel heard the talk and said nothing, but his presence at her side was answer enough. He fixed fences for those who doubted, delivered calves for men who wouldn't meet his eyes, and over time, the whispers softened. They always did when faced with quiet consistency. Late one afternoon, Brenda returned from town with a folded newspaper, its edges worn thin. She spread it on the table, pointing to a small notice near the back. "There," she said. Daniel leaned in. It was a brief mention of Silas Boone selling off portions of his holdings farther south, rumors of debts and failed ventures. "Looks like he's losing ground," Daniel said. Brenda traced the print with her finger. "Storms catch everyone eventually," she replied. The thought lingered between them, not with satisfaction, but with a sober understanding of how fragile power could be. That night, Daniel told her about his father, about the bullet still buried beneath the hearth, about promises made and broken. He had never spoken the words aloud before. Brenda listened without interruption, her hand resting lightly on his knee, grounding him in the present. When he finished, he felt emptied and lighter all at once. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For trusting me," she answered. Summer arrived fully, bringing long days and aching muscles. Brenda's garden took hold, green shoots pushing stubbornly through the soil. Blue asters bloomed first, then prairie roses, their color startling against the rough logs of the cabin. Brenda stood back one morning, hands on her hips, satisfaction bright in her eyes. "Now it looks like someone lives here," she said. Daniel looked from the flowers to her and nodded. "It does." They attended their first social gathering together at the Halvorsons' barn, a modest affair with fiddle music and too much stew. Brenda hesitated at the door, suddenly unsure. Daniel offered his arm, awkward but earnest. She took it. Inside, conversation faltered briefly, then resumed. By the end of the night, Brenda had danced twice and laughed more than she had in years. On the ride home, she leaned into Daniel, tired and content. "I used to think belonging meant being chosen," she said softly. "Now I think it means choosing." Daniel smiled into the dark. "Seems right." The question of marriage came not as a grand proposal, but as a quiet acknowledgement. One evening, as they sat watching the last light fade, Daniel said, "You could have a claim here." "Legal, I mean." Brenda looked at him. "Is that what you want?" "I want you to be safe," he replied. She considered this, then nodded. "Then yes." They spoke to Mr. Garvey, who agreed to stand for them. News traveled fast, and when the day came, it was simple and honest. Brenda wore a dress she had sewn herself, cream-colored and plain. Daniel wore his father's coat. They stood beneath the cottonwood tree Daniel had planted years before, hands clasped, voices steady. There were no grand speeches, only vows spoken clearly and meant. Afterward, neighbors brought small gifts, jars of preserves, bundles of wildflowers. Brenda laughed as she planted them by the window. "So folks know a woman lives here," she said. Married life did not change them so much as it clarified what was already there. They worked side by side, shared burdens, argued and laughed in equal measure. Brenda expanded her lessons, turning one corner of the cabin into a small schoolroom. Daniel began hosting reading nights in the barn, encouraged by her example. Men who had never held a book gathered by lantern light, sounding out words slowly, pride evident in their faces. "Never thought I'd see this place full of voices," Daniel said one night. "Neither did I," Brenda replied, smiling. The valley changed, almost without noticing. Whispers turned to respect. Children grew confident. Men stood a little taller. Another winter came, harsh but familiar. The wind howled as it always had, but inside the cabin, warmth held. Brenda watched Daniel patch the roof, snow dusting his shoulders, and pressed her hand to the glass. "You found me in the snow," she whispered, "and I never felt cold again." Daniel looked up and smiled. The storm raged, but it could not touch what they had built. The winter settled deeper than anyone expected. By December, the plains were locked tight under ice, the sky a pale, unyielding bowl that seemed to press down on the land itself. Daniel rose before dawn each morning, the habits of a lifetime guiding him from bed to boots without thought. Brenda often woke with him now, sitting up to hand him his gloves, fingers lingering just long enough to steal a little warmth before he stepped into the dark. She never asked him to stay in on bad days, and he never asked her not to worry. That was the quiet balance they had struck. When he returned in the evenings, beard rimmed with frost, she would have supper waiting, the smell of stew or bread greeting him like a promise kept. They spoke of small things at first, of cattle and weather and the slow creep of snow against the door, but as the season wore on, their conversations deepened, stretching into the hours after the lamps were lit. Brenda told him stories of Missouri, of her mother's careful hands and the locket she'd sold for the train fare, of the way she used to imagine the world beyond the boarding house kitchen. Daniel listened, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on her face as if committing every word to memory. In return, he spoke of his youth, of days before the war, of his father's laugh and his mother's quiet strength. He spoke of loss without flinching now, because he was no longer alone in carrying it. One evening, as the wind howled particularly fierce outside, Brenda reached for his hand and said softly, "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't gone out that night?" Daniel considered it, the firelight casting long shadows across his face. "I think about what would have happened if I had," he replied. "That's what keeps me steady." The words stayed with her long after they went to bed, a reminder of how thin the line between chance and fate truly was. As the weeks passed, Brenda's presence transformed the cabin in ways Daniel hadn't anticipated. She rearranged shelves to make space, stitched curtains from old flour sacks, and insisted on sweeping snow from the porch each morning, claiming it made the house feel awake. Daniel teased her gently about it, but secretly he watched with something like wonder as the place he'd built for survival became a place meant for living. The schoolroom corner grew more permanent, chalkboards smoothed and rehung, benches added for children who trudged through snow to learn their letters. Sometimes, when the weather turned too cruel, Brenda taught by lamplight while the wind battered the walls, her voice steady and warm as the fire. Daniel often paused in his work to listen, the sound grounding him more than he could explain. The town took notice. Stone Hollow had always been a place slow to change, but even it could not ignore what was happening on the ridge. Parents spoke of their children sounding out words at supper, of wives reading notices without help. Men who once scoffed now nodded in quiet approval. Still, not everyone welcomed the shift. Late one afternoon, Daniel returned from checking traps to find a man waiting by the fence line, hat pulled low, expression tight. Ezra Wilkes was a rancher from the southern edge of the valley, known more for his temper than his livestock. "Heard you've got a school running out here," Ezra said without greeting. Brenda stood a few paces behind Daniel, her posture calm but alert. "My wife teaches," Daniel replied evenly. "Anyone's welcome." Ezra snorted. "Women teaching kids ain't right. Makes 'em soft." Brenda stepped forward before Daniel could answer. "Learning to read won't ruin a child," she said, voice firm. "But ignorance will." Ezra bristled, then hesitated as a few of the children appeared behind Brenda, slates clutched to their chests. Something shifted in his expression, uncertainty warring with pride. "We'll see," he muttered, turning away. Daniel watched him go, tension coiled tight in his shoulders. That night, he lay awake listening to the wind, the encounter gnawing at him. Brenda sensed it, turning toward him in the dark. "He won't stop what's already started," she murmured. "People rarely do, once they've seen what's possible." Daniel hoped she was right. The first real trouble came not from gossip or disapproval, but from the land itself. In late January, a stretch of fence collapsed under the weight of snow, allowing 2 head of cattle to wander dangerously close to Boone's former holdings. Daniel and Brenda rode out together to retrieve them, the air biting and sharp. They found the cattle easily enough, but as they turned back, Daniel noticed tracks cutting across the trail, fresh and deliberate. He frowned, scanning the horizon. "Someone's been riding out here," he said. Brenda glanced around, unease prickling her skin. "Could it be Silas?" Daniel shook his head. "He's licking his wounds elsewhere. But land like this doesn't stay quiet forever." The thought lingered as they repaired the fence and rode home, the sense that peace, while earned, was never guaranteed. In February, a letter arrived, forwarded from town, bearing an unfamiliar seal. Brenda opened it carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. "It's from the county office," she said. "About land records." Daniel felt a chill unrelated to the cold. They read it together by the fire. The letter referenced unresolved claims tied to George Parker's estate, noting discrepancies that required clarification. Brenda's hand tightened on the paper. "They're still trying to untangle his mess," she whispered. Daniel nodded grimly. Parker left more than one loose end. Over the next weeks, Daniel made several trips to town, meeting with clerks and answering questions. Brenda stayed behind, teaching and tending the cabin, but worry gnawed at her. Each time Daniel returned, she searched his face for signs of bad news. He always smiled reassuringly, but she could tell the strain was wearing on him. One night, she said quietly, "You don't have to carry this alone." Daniel sighed, pulling her close. "I know. Old habits die hard." The resolution came unexpectedly. In early March, Mr. Garvey rode out to the cabin, his horse lathered, his expression unusually animated. "It's settled," he announced as he stepped inside. County ruled the claims void. Parker never completed the transfer. Boone's papers were full of holes. Brenda let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, relief washing through him. "It's done," Garvey said. "No one can contest your land now." After he left, Daniel and Brenda stood together in the quiet cabin, the weight of uncertainty finally lifting. Brenda laughed softly, the sound bubbling up unexpected and free. Daniel joined her, the laughter easing something deep within him. Spring followed close on the heels of that news. The snow melted in earnest, rivers swelling, grass pushing green and stubborn through the mud. Brenda expanded her garden, hands deep in the earth, planting rows of vegetables and herbs. Daniel repaired what winter had broken, hammer ringing bright in the fresh air. They worked side by side, comfortable in shared silence. One afternoon, as Brenda knelt planting seedlings, she paused and looked up at Daniel. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. He wiped his brow, considering. "Sometimes. But not because I want to. More like, curiosity. She nodded. I used to think leaving was the only way forward. Now I think staying can be just as brave. He smiled at her then, a look filled with quiet pride. The first calf of the season was born on a cool April morning, Daniel guiding the delivery while Brenda steadied the lantern. When the calf finally stood, wobbling and new, Brenda laughed, tears in her eyes. I can't believe it, she said. Life just keeps going. Daniel squeezed her shoulder. It always does. Even when we think it won't. As the months passed, the cabin became a gathering place. Reading nights grew louder, lessons more structured. Brenda's confidence blossomed, her voice carrying easily across the room. Daniel watched from the edges, content to let her shine. He had never wanted attention, but he took pride in what they'd built together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink low, Brenda rested her head against his shoulder. Thank you, she said quietly. For that night. For everything after. Daniel wrapped an arm around her. You saved yourself, he replied. I just gave you a place to land. She smiled, knowing the truth lived somewhere between those words. The valley settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by resilience and quiet hope. The storm still came, the wind still howled, but inside the cabin, warmth endured. And though neither Daniel nor Brenda spoke of it often, both knew that what they had found was rare and hard-won, forged not in ease, but in endurance. The kind of love that didn't need grand gestures to survive, only the steady choice to stay. The following winter arrived without ceremony, slipping in quietly as if the land itself had learned patience. The first snow came light and dry, dusting the prairie in pale silver rather than burying it. Daniel noticed the change before anyone else. He always did. He stood on the porch one morning, breath curling in the cold, watching the way the wind moved differently now, less angry, more measured. Behind him, the cabin stirred to life. Brenda hummed softly as she set a pot on the stove, the familiar sounds of their shared mornings settling around him like a second skin. This winter felt different. Not easier, exactly, but steadier. The fear that once lived in the cold no longer held the same power. They had learned its language. The cabin had been strengthened since that first storm. Daniel had reinforced the roof, sealed the gaps, stacked more firewood than he thought they'd need. Brenda had lined shelves with jars of preserved vegetables and fruit, each one carefully labeled in her neat hand. They were prepared, not just for survival, but for living through it together. On the first true blizzard night, when the wind rose and the snow began to scream across the plains, Brenda lit extra lamps and set the kettle on early. Daniel came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots, his shoulders dusted white. He paused just inside the door, watching her move around the room, the glow of firelight softening her features. For a fleeting moment, the memory of that first night cut sharp and clear through his mind. The scream of a horse. The body half buried in snow. The fear that he might already be too late. He shook it off gently and crossed the room. Brenda looked up, meeting his gaze, and smiled. You all right? She asked. Yeah, he said. Just thinking. She poured him coffee without asking, handing him the mug. Their fingers brushed, warm against warm. Outside, the storm howled, but inside, the cabin held. The school lessons continued whenever weather allowed. Children arrived bundled and red-cheeked, stamping snow from their boots, filling the room with noise and laughter. Brenda taught them patiently, adjusting her lessons to the seasons, using stories and examples drawn from the land they knew. Daniel sometimes listened from the doorway, a quiet presence, ready to step in if needed, though he rarely was. The children respected him in a way that didn't require words. One afternoon, as the snow fell thick and fast, Brenda dismissed the class early. The children hurried home, and silence settled over the cabin once more. She stood by the window, watching their small figures disappear into the white. Do you ever think about how close it all came? She asked softly. Daniel joined her, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. "Every now and then," he said. "But not with regret." She turned to him. "Neither do I." That night, as the storm raged on, Brenda dreamed of snow again. But this time she was not cold. She dreamed of warmth, of hands steadying her, of a voice cutting through the wind, refusing to let go. When she woke, Daniel was beside her, breathing slow and even, one arm draped protectively across her waist. She pressed closer, the memory fading, replaced by the certainty of the present. Spring returned, slow but sure. The earth thawed, birds came back in cautious waves, and the valley woke once more. Brenda expanded her lessons, taking them outdoors when the weather allowed. She taught children to read under the open sky, their voices mingling with birdsong and wind. Daniel repaired fences, tended cattle, and found himself smiling more often than he remembered doing in years. One afternoon, a wagon arrived at the cabin bearing a family newly arrived in the territory, faces tired and hopeful. They had heard there was a woman who could teach their children, a man who knew the land. Brenda welcomed them without hesitation, offering water and bread. Daniel helped them find a place to camp, pointing out where the ground would be safest. As the wagon rolled away, Brenda watched it go, thoughtful. "We were like that once," she said. Daniel nodded. "Lost and hoping." "And found," she added quietly. Summer brought abundance. The garden thrived, the prairie bloomed, and the cabin stood solid against the seasons. Evenings were spent on the porch, watching the sky turn pink and gold, the day's work settling into tired muscles. Sometimes they spoke of the past, sometimes of nothing at all. The comfort lay in the shared silence, in the knowledge that neither of them had to fill it anymore. In early autumn, as the air sharpened once more, Daniel and Brenda walked the ridge line together, surveying the land. The valley stretched out before them, wide and enduring. Brenda stopped, turning slowly, taking it all in. "This place tried to kill me once," she said lightly. Daniel studied her face. "And now?" She smiled, the kind of smile that carried truth in it. "Now it feels like home." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining easily, naturally. The years that followed did not come without hardship. There were lean seasons, sickness, loss in the valley that touched them too. But there was also growth, laughter, and a sense of purpose that anchored them when the wind rose and the nights grew long. The cabin became known not as a place of scandal or rumor, but as a place of warmth. Travelers spoke of it with gratitude. Children remembered it as the place they first learned their letters. Neighbors came for advice, for help, for company. And through it all, Daniel and Brenda remained steady, shaped by what they had endured, strengthened by what they had chosen. Another winter came, echoing that first one in its fury. The wind howled across the plains, snow driving hard against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned bright. Brenda stood by the window, shawl around her shoulders, watching Daniel on the roof, patching a small leak before the storm worsened. She pressed her hand to the glass, her breath fogging it. The memory returned, unbidden, of lying helpless in the snow, the cold creeping in. She whispered, more to herself than anything else, "You found me in the snow, and from that day on, I never felt cold again." Daniel climbed down, his coat dusted white, and looked up at her through the window. He smiled, that same quiet smile that had greeted her waking weeks ago, months ago, years ago. She smiled back. The storm raged, fierce and unrelenting, but it could not touch what they had built. The cabin glowed against the white, a small, stubborn beacon of warmth on the vast Wyoming plain. He had saved her from the snow, but she had saved him from the silence. And together, they had turned a place of survival into a home, proving that even in the harshest winters, something beautiful could take root and endure.